It's a beautiful Saturday morning, and you're welcome to yet another exciting edition of China Now with me, Markiza Latifa. Elated to be coming your way with the show. Let's get into China Currents, where we bring you stories that made headways in China in the past few days. And in this episode, Tesla's voice assistant has been cleared to connect to a homegrown AI model, signaling a new phase of tech integration. Also coming up, DeepSeek has open sourced its V4 model, turning ultra-long context windows into a standard feature. We'll also bring you the story of a flying taxi which has taken off in Qingyang, marking another step towards air mobility. And in a powerful moment for medical innovation, a brain-computer interface has helped a paralyzed art teacher paint again. We have details of these stories and many more coming up shortly. Please stay with us. China Currents starts now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's China Currents. Here's what's coming up. In China, Tesla's voice assistant has been cleared to connect to a homegrown AI model. DeepSeek open-sourced V4, turning a million token context window from a luxury into a default feature. A flying taxi lifted off the runway in Qingyang, and a brain-computer interface helped a paralyzed art teacher paint a family portrait again. Let's start on the road with Tesla. On April 22nd, Chinese business outlet STCN reported that Tesla's in-car voice service in China has been approved to connect to homegrown AI models. According to Tesla China's updated voice assistant terms of service, the voice system in Tesla model vehicles will plug into two Chinese AI models at once, DeepSeek and Doubao, made by ByteDance. The division of labor is simple. Doubao handles voice commands, navigation, music, climate control, and sort of thing, and DeepSeek handles the conversational stuff, small talk, weather, news. Why does this matter? For years, Tesla's voice assistant was mocked by Chinese drivers as an artificial idiot, because China is a country of 1.4 billion people and at least 10 major dialect groups. Standard Mandarin, the version most foreigners learn, is just one of them. So for 80 million people living in, say, Sichuan province, getting Tesla to adjust temperature meant first pressing, "Hey, Tesla," and then carefully enunciating, "set to 24 degrees," in textbook Mandarin. Try a compound sentence and the system fell apart. Now, once the update rolls out with the Chinese-trained AI under the hood, you can keep your hands on the wheel and just say, "It's a bit stuffy in here, turn on the AC and take me to the nearest coffee shop." And the car does it. Compound commands, dialects, back and forth conversation, all in one go. And this story is bigger than just Tesla. As of today, more than 7 million smart cars in China are already running on Doubao. That's over 50 brands and 145 vehicle models, with more than 30 million in-cabin interactions every day. In other words, the cars on Chinese roads are increasingly running on Chinese souls. Speaking of Chinese AI, there's a bigger news this week. On April 24th, DeepSeek released its new V4 model series and posted the weights online the same day. Two versions came out together. V4 Pro is the high-performance one, and the V4 Flash is the lighter, more affordable version. Both versions natively support a 1 million token context window. What does it mean? Enough to swallow about 2 copies of the Lord of the Rings trilogy in one go, or 200 to 300 pages of legal contracts and financial reports. From now on, 1 million tokens is the default for every official DeepSeek service. The most important detail for ordinary users is the web app and the official mobile app are still completely free. And once you give a free AI 1 million token memory, the list of things you can do with it gets a lot longer. A student studying for exams can drop a whole textbook into it, get the key points highlighted, generate a set of practice questions, and have the trickiest chapter re-explained. An office worker can dump a year's worth of contracts, emails, and meetings into the system and ask for a year-end review. A hobbyist coder can hand V4 Pro a paragraph describing what they want and get back a full working project. In what's known as agentic coding, that's AI that writes code by acting like a developer, not just suggesting snippets, V4 Pro now leads the open source pack. DeepSeek itself says the experience is better than Cloud Sonnet 4.5, with output quality close to Opus 4.6. For developers and businesses, the bigger story is the API price drop. DeepSeek noted in its technical report that the system has been validated on both NVIDIA GPUs and Huawei's Ascend chips. And once Huawei's Ascend 950 supernodes ship at scale later this year, V4 Pro pricing is expected to drop further. Now, let's leave the screens behind and look up. Our next story takes us to Qingyang in northwestern China. On the morning of April 26, the world's first quad-certified pilotless passenger aircraft completed a demonstration flight in Qingyang City. The aircraft is the EH216-S, made by the Chinese company Yihan. Its top cruising speed is around 130 kilometers per hour, and a single charge gets you about 30 kilometers, roughly the distance from a typical city center to its airport. You might be wondering, okay, but what does this have to do with me? Here's the headline. It was the first verified test of an eVTOL operating in the same airspace as regular airliners. Imagining you've just landed at the airport. Instead of squeezing onto a shuttle bus or sitting in highway traffic for an hour, you walk over and step into a flying taxi. 15 minutes later, it sets you down at your hotel. That's the future being trialed in China. And it's closer than you might think. Back in March, Yihan's operating subsidiary received China's first batch of operating licenses for passenger-carrying drones. Right now, in 2 locations, in Guangzhou and Hefei, anyone can buy a ticket and take a sightseeing flight. So if you happen to be in Guangzhou or Hefei this weekend, you can actually go see one in person or even ride in one. In China, the flying taxi is no longer science fiction. It's quietly becoming part of everyday life. Our last story is also about movement, but of a far more personal kind. And it's the most moving piece of news from China this week. It comes from Nanchang. On April 22nd, China's second ever fully implanted, fully wireless, fully functional brain-computer interface clinical trial reached a major breakthrough. The procedure took place at the first affiliated hospital of Nanchang University. The patient is a 29-year-old art teacher called Mr. Deng. Last June, he slipped at the edge of a swimming pool. The fall broke his neck. He lost the use of both legs and both hands. For a while, he felt his life had lost all meaning. The turning point came in December. A brain-computer interface developed by NeuroAccess, a Shanghai-based BCI company, was implanted into his brain. The system uses a flexible electrode array that sits on the surface of the cortex, just under the dura, without piercing the brain tissue itself. The battery is built into a separate module under the skin of his chest, which keeps the heat-generating component well away from the brain. It is the first such system in China, and only the second in the world to fully implant the battery as well. There are no wires running outside the body. A short wireless charge keeps it running all day. The most stunning thing is the speed. From the moment the brain forms an intention to the signal being captured, decoded, transmitted, and turned into an actual movement, the whole loop runs in under 50 milliseconds. That's about twice as fast as a human blink. The thought of grabbing a pen and the hand starting to move for all practical purposes, they happen at the same instant. 1 month after the surgery, Mr. Deng could grasp objects, write, and draw all on his own. He uses a brain-controlled exoskeleton glove to feed himself, and with his own hand holding onto a pen with steady precision. He painted a family portrait. He wrote the words, "Happy Birthday," finally completing a gift he'd been unable to give his son on the boy's first birthday. And the weight of this story goes far beyond one father's recovery. In China alone, there are over 26 million stroke survivors, and a significant share of them live with some form of paralysis. Add in patients with spinal cord injuries, ALS, and a rapidly aging population, and moving again with your mind stops being a sci-fi premise. It becomes a quiet, daily wish in tens of thousands of households. Tao Hu, founder and chief scientist at NeuroAccess, said the first case proved we could do it. The second case proved that it can be scaled. NeuroAccess has now run 54 brain-computer interface trials around China. The next step is registering for multi-center clinical trials and going through formal medical device approval. A few years from now, brain-computer interfaces may no longer be a one-off headline. They could be a standard option at any rehabilitation hospital and possibly one day covered by health insurance. That's all for this week's China Currents. Thank you for watching and see you next time.
And now we turn to the Thinkers Forum, where ideas challenge the way we see the world. In this edition, economist Warwick Powell offers a striking perspective in why energy, not politics, will decide Iran, Taiwan, and everyone else's future. Rather than focusing on military power or political narratives, Dr. Powell argues that the real driver of global outcomes is far more fundamental: thermodynamics. Who controls energy, and more importantly, who can use it most efficiently, may ultimately shape the balance of power in the years ahead. We've got interesting insights coming up in this segment of the show. Please don't go anywhere.
I think what's happened in Venezuela and what's happening in Iran is a reflection of the fact that the US political economy has reached a point where it's elite, together with those other factors that I talked about. You bring all of that together under the pressures of declining energy return on energy invested, and you've got the preconditions for war.
Hello everyone, my name is Yun Peng. Welcome to Thinkers Forum. I am very, very excited to speak to today's guest. You know, every now and then you read a book, its theoretical framework is innovative, it's fascinating, the arguments are rock solid, but the timing is unmatched. Today's guest, his new book came out March the 15th, I think, 2 weeks after the Iran conflict started, and the book, titled Thermoeconomics in the Time of Monsters, is precisely about how energy is the ultimate constraint on national growth, on economic development. Dr. Warwick Powell, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Let's jump straight in. So if you're right, that means some of the most basic assumptions of classical economics are wrong, like energy being only an input of production, of, say, growth is ultimately infinite. These are all wrong. So why should people believe you?
Well, because I didn't make up the laws of thermodynamics. And the laws of thermodynamics tell us that basically, well, a couple of important things. One is that energy is not something that we can create or destroy. Energy simply changes form. And so what human societies constantly try to do is harness energy and transform it into things that are useful for humans and human societies. So that's the first thing. The second thing about the law of thermodynamics is that it really tells us that because it can't be created and it can't be destroyed, it nonetheless has its own inherent dynamics towards entropy. And in a very simple sense, that simply means that nature itself is constantly degrading, if you will, as well as renewing. So entropy, becoming more complex, fragmented, dissipative, chaotic, is part and parcel of how nature itself works. And so you bring these two things together and you realise that human societies are basically energetic transformation systems. Then ultimately this fundamental foundation in physics must be the final constraint on the things that we as humans can try to do in our world. I often say that functional human societies basically need to be able to have food for people and fuel for machines. Right? Both of these are fundamentally energetic questions, and that energetic proposition can only come from one place, and that is, of course, nature itself. And so the historical dynamic of human societies involves a combination of our ability to successfully intervene, to manage entropy through negentropic interventions on the one hand, and secondly,
what is negentropic? Just for
it's the reverse of it. It's the ability to bring order and to bring stability to a situation. So we want to be able to bring order and stability to enable reproduction, but the constant substrate is the system's dissipative, it's fragmenting all the time. And so it takes energy to keep order, and the more successful we are at harnessing nature's energies, the more energy surpluses we have available as societies to do all sorts of other things that we need.
Just to clarify, when we're talking about surplus of energy here, we're not talking about a country's output of energy sources. We're talking about a society's general utilization of energy beyond the point of self-sustaining.
Correct. So because reproduction is the fundamental purpose to be able to do things again the next day, to survive and live, complex societies are ones that have a high level of surplus energy available to it to do things more than just what basic reproduction requires. So if you think about this as a biological or a metabolism requires a certain amount of energy to be able to survive. To get that energy, it needs to expend energy to go and harvest that energy. Now, a simple reproduction system simply uses the energy that it needs to survive, and it just becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. But because of entropy, of course, it'll slowly degrade and fall apart. So what societies are actually trying to do is harness a higher level of energy through the use of a certain amount of energy. So we call that energy return on energy invested. So if I expended 1 unit of energy to make available to me 20 or 30 units of energy, and I only need 1 unit of energy to reproduce my own activity, it means that I have 29 units of energy available for other things. Now that's important in complex, sophisticated social systems, because what those other things are, of course, are dependents who can't go and get the energy, children, old people, etc. It is also how we create and sustain the sort of cultural and fixed infrastructure foundations of modern civilized societies, because all of those things are actually just embedded energy as well. So if the only energy that we could get as human societies was only enough to feed ourselves, we don't actually have the means by which we can then create all of these other things that we today would call modernity. We've harvested all the oil at the surface or whatever it happens to be, and we have to spend more and more energy getting the energy that's available in nature. And we don't notice straight away that our systemic energy efficiency is declining because we don't experience it immediately. In our lives, we still, the legacy that was built on high energy surpluses is still there and we enjoy it. But over time, we start to see how declining energy return on energy invested actually manifests. Roads that don't get fixed, bridges that begin to fall apart, buildings that begin to fall apart, deferred maintenance. All of these are symptoms of systemic energy inefficiency relative to the heyday when there was abundant surplus available.
Is this what you call an entropic decay in
That's
your
it.
book?
That's right.
Okay. I want to talk about the other side of the entropic decay concept. You said the society's rise and fall ultimately depends on how well it fights this entropic decay, and you call that fighting process and entropic process. Give us some examples of how societies can fight this entropic process.
Energetic renewal at a very foundational level, at a substrate level in a sense. So investing in research and development to find new ways of accessing nature's energy that can bring energetic renewal. So as energy return on energy invested declines, functional societies are able to replenish their energetic stock, if you will, and get that energetic return on energy invested back on a rising trajectory until, of course, those resources begin to diminish, and we're constantly needing to find ways of doing that. And so energetic renewal is absolutely critical to how successful societies are to sustain themselves and to literally continue kicking the can of entropy down the road.
Okay, so when we're talking about this process here, we're not just talking about, say, using solar or wind to replace traditional fossil fuel energies. We're also talking about how industrial processes can become more efficient and everything around industrial capacity serving the purpose of kicking the can down the road because the resources are finite.
So if we think of economies now as energetic transformation systems, what they in effect are doing is harnessing energy available by means of machines and humans to mobilize other resources, things, material stuff, going through processes of transformation to make things that are useful. Okay. Now, all of these processes, of course, are literally just transformations of energy from one form into another form. And as that happens, entropy, of course, implies that there is waste in these processes. We also need to have ways of streamlining the flow of these things, because every time there is a blockage in the system, it incurs essentially some kind of entropic price, because we are having to incur an energetic cost for something that is not actually in circulation. So reproduction implies circulation. And practical example would be goods having to be stored in warehouses for a long period of time, or goods being stuck in transit because the road system's no good, or the bridges haven't been built, or what have you.
Produce the product that the market doesn't want, and
that's right. And now we've wasted it. So that's a real sense of waste, right? And so what ties this system together is actually information. We can't have information systems without consuming energy, whether it was using energy to make paper or to grind the powder to make ink, or to feed pigeons to fly things around, or of course today, to be able to have data collection systems. So currently we know, for example, with the war against Iran, that there are active efforts pretty much every week to affect the fluctuations in the paper price of oil. Right. And information that is being produced has very definite financial implications in the short term, but which arguably are actually entropic in the long term, because whilst you might keep prices from fluctuating too much in the short term, it masks the fact that the available stock is actually running
20% is just taken off the market.
It's taken off, and yet the price arguably doesn't reflect that.
Right.
So that's an example of, I guess, what you would call ultimately a kind of unviable.
This is very interesting, because as I was reading your book, and I have to be honest here, I only finished about 2/3 in, and the first half was very theory-laden. And part of the interview I want to do is to illustrate to the listeners how you can apply this way of understanding the world into real-world events. And I think the conflict in Iran is a perfect example. And you mentioned how information works in price manipulation, but I want you to set up a contrast between your understanding of the conflict and how a more standard geopolitical analysis, and say what they missed by not applying your method.
Yeah, look, I'll finish the theoretical piece with one more thing to try to paint the picture. So we've talked about this sort of energetic transformation piece, we've talked about the information piece, and I've kind of hinted at the financial piece, right? So complex systems, economic systems, are basically three intertwined circuits that nonetheless have their own dynamic. And the circuits are the energetic reproduction circuit, the payment circuit. So as energy is transformed into useful things and it circulates, what's actually circulating in the other direction is money. We have financial circuits where money as a claim on the future is injected into the system as liquidity to mobilise resources, but it can have a life of its own, because once it's mobilised a set of resources in the real economy and those resources have been transformed, the money still exists in exactly the same form. And if money is understood as a right to something, some value in the future, the challenge the system as a whole has is that if that available claim on the future is greater than the ability of the future to deliver on it. So there's an efficiency process, but there's a rhythm there, or a cadence. But the monetary circuits and the fictitious capital circuits actually can accelerate. New liquidity can be injected into the system quicker and easier and cheaper than
the real
energetic transformation. Yeah. And we start to see a bifurcation in the economic system where the monetary and fictitious capital circuits, in a sense, outgrow the capacity of the real economy. So you've got these three circuits, and you're trying to keep them reasonably aligned with each other. Right. And if they're reasonably aligned with each other, and you are continuing to make possible innovation at the real economy level, then the system has a high probability of being able to perpetuate for a reasonable amount of time and deliver the kinds of things that modern societies expect. But if they get out of sync with each other, then the likelihoods of crises are much more. So we bring all of that back to what's happening in Iran. I think it's one way of reading it, I guess, is that it's a US-Israel war for the Holy Land, right? So there's an argument around that. And it's not that elements of that aren't true, that the passions that come from a certain kind of apocalyptic politics doesn't play a role in energizing people to do things, and also gives people, particularly those in positions of decision-making power, that sense of invincibility and purpose. It's not entirely untrue that it doesn't play a role. Other people talk about it as sort of security competition in a broad sense. So the China containment stuff, it's about China, containing China, blocking off China's access to energy, whether it was the Strait of Malacca or the Straits of Hormuz or what have you.
People like Albert Kirby.
Yeah, there's a part of an argument of that. What I would say is that there's actually one other part, which actually goes very much to how this substrate of real energy transformations, dissipation and entropy play out, almost as the backdrop, if you will.
Do you think this is the backdrop parallel to the other geopolitical analysis, or do you think this is a fundamentally determinative aspect of this conflict?
It will determine the final parameters. And it will do that because when national systems finally confront and realise that their systemic energy efficiency is actually declining, they have a few ways in which they can respond to it, a few negentropic responses. One is to do some of the things that we discussed earlier, to improve efficiency in the systems and all of that. Another one would be to try to drive transformations to access new higher EROEI possibilities.
Energy return on
energy invested. Now, that isn't always about somehow changing a fuel type. So the argument that I run is not really fuel type prejudiced. It's quite agnostic. It's really about the energy return, energy invested, whether it's renewables or what have you. For me, that's not the metric. The metric that matters is that energy return ratio.
Yeah.
So a nation state could seek to extract more energy from available known sources because they've improved the technology of some sort. So we're able to get to the oil that we know is there, but which 20 years ago we couldn't get because it was...
like the shale revolution.
Shale or what have you, right? So I can do that. Alternatively, you can go to the world and seek to enter into trade, to buy low entropy energy from other parts of the world.
That's the commodity market.
Commodity market, enter into trade relationships with the global market for available energies. And last but not least, we get a kind of thermo-economic imperialism, which is we don't want to buy it, we don't want anyone else to have it, so we're going to take it ourselves. And in a sense, I think what's happened in Venezuela And what's happening in Iran is a reflection of the fact that the US political economy has reached a point where its elite, together with those other factors that I talked about, you bring all of that together under the pressures of declining energy, return on energy invested, and you've got the preconditions for, and so it doesn't have to be determinative, but it certainly creates the pressures that societies and their economic systems and institutions need to deal with. This particular presidency has a particular way of dealing with these issues, and they include going to war.
How do you respond to people who say that this all makes sense, but it doesn't really add much new to the old imperialism analysis of just people going around and taking oil, which the Dutch, the English, the Americans have been doing for hundreds of years?
Well, that's what we observe. What I try and do is actually explain the reasons why this ends up happening. Right? It's not always that somehow countries or organisations just work on a whim, right? And one day wake up and decide to go and start a war or to take something. It's actually fundamentally conditioned by these sorts of constraints, because once you reach a point where you are unable to reproduce what you had before, you in a sense have no choice but to seek to supplement and replenish your energetic reservoir. There's a few ways you can go about doing that, as I said. And what I'm trying to do here is to say, look, we can observe all of these things, the war, the imperialism and things. What ultimately, in our material world, creates the conditions that make these kinds of actions more likely than not? And so if we're interested in reducing the probability of warfare, then one of our key challenges is actually to find ways of enhancing energy efficiency systemically, not only as single nation states, but also at a global level.
Right. And one thing I found really disturbing was that the United States launched this war arguably because of the energy crisis, precisely at a decade where it's coming off the high of the shale revolution, when its domestic reservoir, at least the ones that they can successfully exploit, has been going up. And under your analysis, I would assume you would argue that the energy return on energy investment of those shale is going down.
Correct. And we know this because we know that the useful life of many of the wells, their useful life in terms of time is diminishing, right? So 2 or 3 years and they're having to move on. The effort that's required, the energy that's required to be consumed to tap the next unit of energy continues to rise. Again, it's not to say that the stock isn't there. The issue is that the energy required to convert that dormant stock in nature into usable flow is no longer as efficient as it once was. That manifests itself in very interesting ways, because it also shows how the gap between the world of fictitious capital, how things get priced, exchange value, if you will, and the world of use values, the sort of real constraints in the end.
And the use value is
the material, energetic foundations of our world. And if those two things sort of separate too far, they ultimately will get brought back down to earth, because basically thermodynamic reality has the last say. But what happens in the meantime is quite paradoxical, because if the exchange value of shale, for instance, goes up, which it will, and LNG goes up, it will actually attract more resources to be deployed into it that will accelerate the depletion of whatever EROEI level stocks available, and actually accelerate the depletion of that resource.
I've actually heard energy analysts arguing that this process, instead of depleting it faster, would actually make the exploration process cheaper, so the EROEI would go up in this process.
Unlikely. It's not like we need to do much more exploration per se. A lot of the reserves are known. The work's been done. The stocks are available. It's just a question of what cost there is to access them and how long they will last. And so it would lead to essentially the accelerated exploitation of a stock that is actually at a diminishing level of EROEI. And again, it's important to make the distinction between this as somehow running out of oil versus just having to be less efficient at getting the oil that is there. And it's a very important distinction. Maybe it will run out, maybe not, right? You don't know that it's run out until you take that last slurp, right? When you take that last slurp and realise that there's nothing left.
It's like my bank account.
Yeah, then you have to, because it looks okay, right, as you keep going until the last minute. So my own sense is that the United States has confronted this reality that despite the fact that it has abundant raw available resource, that its EROEI is actually diminishing. Yeah. That's a systemic problem, right? But when financial signals actually encourage more exploitation of this resource in the short term, it actually perversely leads to financial enrichment on the one hand. So the shale oil guys are laughing all the way to the bank, whilst at the same time accelerating the depletion of available energetic surpluses to the United States as a whole. Financial benefits, system energetic depletion.
It's like an addiction that keeps the patient going without the patient knowing that addiction is killing it.
That's right. It's hollowing them out from the inside. Right. And so it's not a determinative thing. So what I try and avoid in the structure of the argument in the book and thinking about the dynamics is that in the end, whether human society succeed or fail in these processes of energetic renewals is not a function of the fact that it somehow automatically successfully finds a new way. Right. It may or it may not. It may stumble on new things by chance. More often than not, it won't stumble on them by chance. It will be based on discoveries. It's also about the systemic efficiencies of energy to circulate things. Yeah. And so you've really got to take that holistic view about this. So yeah, Iran, I think we can better understand Iran by understanding that substrate. Iranian oil is still relatively high EROEI globally speaking. Same with Russian oil, by the way. And partly I think the US, wrapped up with this sense of rivalry, this sense of containment, together with some of this millenarian zealotry that you get. You put all of these things together and that created a cauldron. The real pressure point ultimately comes from the energy efficiency depletion.
Yeah. I want to talk about countries and places that are obviously unable to deal with the energy shock caused by the Iran conflict by themselves. Places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Taiwan, of course. And just to use Taiwan as an example, there's widespread report that Taiwan doesn't have much reserve in terms of oil and gas. It has a limited ability to buy it from the commodity market because it's not a large buyer. It has a very limited capacity to scale up its renewable energy production capacity. So if you were advising the Taiwanese leaders, tough job, and especially given its industrial profile, places like TSMC uses up to, I heard, 10% of all electricity generated in Taiwan. What kind of advice would you give them in this time junction?
Look, it is a difficult thing because moments of crisis often force you to do things that you would otherwise not do. And the mainland has made overtures, or at least indicated to the folk in Taipei that the mainland would be willing to provide energy assistance to the island. Obviously, at the moment, the island has rejected those overtures, right. But time will tell, right? Because, as I said, when the pressure finally comes and you're on the brink of having to shut down your most lucrative export enterprise because of a shortage of energy, and that those processes are not ones that you can really afford to interrupt anyway, then there will be a different set of considerations, I think. But doubtless, Taipei will seek to defer as much as they can through, and almost at any price at the moment, and in large part that's for domestic island political considerations. We are now 1 week or so on from when KMT chairwoman Zheng Liwen visited Beijing. And I think that in and of itself has placed some pressure on the DPP to address this issue of peace across the Straits in a way that I don't think they've had to face for quite some time. And we've already seen the DPP try to criticise Zheng's visit and, in a sense, rejected the 10-point proposal from the mainland, which will be there anyway, more flights, youth groups and all of that.
Right.
But it's certainly, I think, creating an environment where there are many people on the island are increasingly wondering whether they would have once thought of as a stable status quo.
Yeah, but it's never stable, right?
Status quo is always changing.
Right, it's always dependent on the U.S. remaining in East Asia and continuing its military or ambiguity of committing to the threat.
And it's relative strength too, right? So, the status quo in 1996 is certainly not the status quo in 2026, even though on paper everyone says, well, it's the same status quo, but of course it's not. And we know that with all the opinion surveys that are done around this question, the issue of what constitutes people's understanding of the status quo today is very different, I think, to how people thought of the status quo 20 or 30 years ago. The challenge for the island, I think, is that the status quo has radically changed. The military balance, of course, is very different today. But I think this issue of energy, again, is the final arbiter. And if it cannot find a non-mainland related pathway to sustaining the energetic systems that they have, then, well, I think, one, it'll become a political issue on the island. They've got some elections at the end of this year, and then in, 2028. And these things won't go away. For those who follow energy politics on the island, they'll know that there's been a long-standing debate about the nuclear power plants.
They just shut off it last year.
And of course, they're now talking about possibly having to turn them back on. There was a referendum run not so long ago. It didn't get the requisite number of votes to even be valid, but nonetheless, the numbers that did vote in favour of turning those nuclear power plants back on, showed that people did want something to be done.
Right.
Yeah, so.
And that's the point that really, really bothered me, because as you mentioned, public opinions is a big thing on the island. Despite I'm being completely aligned with your view on how this issue theoretically should be resolved in the best interest of the Taiwanese people. Peaceful reunification, given Taiwanese energy and industrial profile, should be the way to go. But polls after polls, we see that there's a big chunk of the Taiwanese population saying that they do not want reunification, at least in the immediate term, with the mainland government. How does your framework take into consideration a localized, particular political will against perhaps a optimal energetic path?
Well, as I say, the energetic path will, in a sense, be the ultimate arbiter of success or failure. Social institutions can try lots of different things, and whilst there is no single success pathway, meaning that there are many ways of being close enough to being optimal, to be viable, and continually refined and improved. The aim of politics, perhaps on the island, will be to defer for as long as they possibly can the confrontation with energetic reality, and they may seek to reactivate the nuclear power plants, for example. There may be attempts to secure alternative gas supplies, because public institutions will be seeking pathways to achieve a neg-entropic outcome that they believe is tolerable. Right?
So that means economic hardship and maybe even rationing if they can't secure independent energy resources.
That's right. Australia is going to go through this as well, right?
And to me, like the cases between Australia and Taiwan, the obvious difference is that there is a solution for the Taiwanese people, and the solutions on the table offered repeatedly by the government in Beijing. So what is the policy implication following your framework for Beijing's Taiwan policy?
The political layer, if you will, isn't reducible to the energy layer. The energy layer will determine in the end whether the political choices are correct. And if the political choices can defer confrontation with energetic reality for as long as possible, then they will get away with things for as long as possible. If the political choices ultimately lead to a situation where that energetic substrate essentially just says, this isn't going to keep going. There simply isn't enough energetic surplus within this system, this particular structure, to meet the aspirations of the society, to pay for schools and hospitals and whatever else it is that it's trying to deliver.
If it comes down to it, and the Taiwanese government has to shut off part of TSMC's production capacity, what do you think the global AI and chip supply chain, what kind of shock will it be to the supply chain as a whole?
Well, it'll just be another shock to the AI supply chain now, because I think the AI supply chain, particularly in the US, is confronting electricity supply issues. And in fact, the third part of my book actually goes into this issue of electricity and AI in quite a bit of detail as a way of explaining how two very different systems are approaching this question of AI from a thermoeconomics point of view. The US AI system is, well, all AI is ultimately a question of electricity, right? And what we do know is that AI in China benefits from a relatively lower cost of electricity and an abundance of electricity. AI in the United States is now confronting electricity constraints. We know that a number of planned AI data centers have been deferred.
And why is China's AI capacity benefiting from an
abundance of electricity?
Right.
And in large part because China has been on this processes of energetic renewal.
Is it because of their investment in energy efficiency, in alternative sources, building infrastructure, everything?
The entire system has been transformed from, if you think of China in 1990, say, it was a country with unstable electricity supply.
Right. I remember it.
Yep,
yeah.
Me too. I remember visiting family in villages in Guangdong province in 88 and 89, for example, where the villagers still had no electricity. They had yet to be connected to the grid. That Guangzhou itself used to have scheduled brownouts each week. Different districts, would have to take their turn because there actually wasn't enough electricity production available. And I think also the transmission network had limits, so it couldn't carry enough electricity anyway. So this was only 35, 36 years ago.
Guangzhou?
Guangzhou, yep. So, and that system was mainly reliant on coal. Today's electricity system in China is multidimensional. It has, of course, coal, nuclear, some gas, hydro, and increasingly wind and solar as part of its mix. And this transformation process has delivered an abundance of electricity in China. Many mainstream Western economists would, of course, say that that represents wasteful investment, but I think history will show that this commitment to building out this capability will hold China in good stead, particularly as it goes through this phase of energetic renewal in its industrial systems with AI, robotics, etc.
Right, and when you were saying renewal, it's not just growing capacity, right? It's also about rebuilding the infrastructure, making it more efficient.
And transforming some of the qualitative dimensions. So if you think about renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, they're often seen as intermittent sources. The wind doesn't always blow, and of course the sun's not always shining. And an important part of the solution to that is storage technologies 15 years ago were really very inefficient, not really up to handle that kind of role systemically. And so at that point in time, things like solar panels were actually pretty inefficient, even with those innovations from the Chinese Australian researcher. But nonetheless, got to a point where you could use solar panels on a house and people would be able to run electric lights and things. But
my parents' apartment got the first solar panel about 15 years ago, and it was very limited, even for a 3-person household.
yeah, and it was just a supplement. Today, combined with the batteries that are available and the efficiency of the harvesting of the sun's energy, a house can actually be more or less self-sufficient in energy. So that's an important transformation. It's taken solar from something that was actually relatively low EROEI to something that can operate at a much higher EROEI level. It also enables renewable energy now to become an industrial proposition and a commercial proposition. And we see that with things like microgrids. So there's a lot more distributed solutions now where batteries enable the provisioning of electricity into places where rolling out the grid might have been, too costly, too difficult. But now microgrids, batteries make all of that viable. And of course, the best battery of them all is the battery on wheels, otherwise known as the EV. And so you add in the electrification of transport, which 15 years ago, again, very few people believed that transportation could be electrified. Maybe the odd scooter, but they certainly didn't think things like trucks could be electrified, and of course they are increasingly now. People didn't believe and couldn't conceive of electrification enabling maritime traffic. Now, we've now seen some electrified container boats. Now, they're not competing with the super-sized 24,000 container types, but nonetheless, they're using containerized batteries to power maritime shipping, which will be very useful for coastal shipping, just hopping from one. And so they will be great for sort of coastal shipping. They will, of course, work very well in places where there's a significant river or canal or estuaries network. Obviously, China has some significant canals and river systems, but also through Southeast Asia, Cambodia, for example, and the Mekong Delta. And I think also some of those ships will be able to support intra-island trade in, for example, the Pacific Islands, which have historically been dependent upon fossil fuel-based transportation to get things from A to B. So these are developments that are happening as a result of this renewal right in China. But on the AI question, the United States is confronting a situation where it's constrained in terms of its ability to meet the growing demands that AI is placing on the electricity network. That constraint in and of itself in parts of the United States has caused the deferral or the cancellation of some data centers. And in other parts of the United States, it's caused a significant increase in electricity prices.
Yeah, sometimes both happen at the same time.
At the same time, right. And it creates what I think we could call an intensified situation of the electricity haves and the electricity have-nots. And it's not just, householders, of course, feel, voters feel the pain of rising electricity prices, but so do other industries. Right. And so as AI makes greater claims on the available energetic system, it actually adversely affects the performance of other parts of the system.
Right.
And we often call that a Dutch disease problem, right? Where resources sort of rush to, the boom sector, but often means that other sectors are undermined. And I think one of the risks that the United States faces now, and my book goes into it a bit, is precisely this dynamic, and this is an energetic surplus problem. Right?
I remember there was an article that you wrote just a couple of weeks ago arguing that the reshoring of manufacturing in the United States is a fantasy, largely because of the lack of energy reserve. And at the time, I didn't quite get it, because I was thinking about the sheer amount of energy the United States has in store, but I wasn't thinking about it in terms of the energy return on energy investment and how unlikely it is that TSMC can just plug up and re-plug in America and replace the 15% of production.
Well, and that's, again, that's the one that ultimately is the final arbiter. You can get away with not being 100% optimal.
Right.
But if you are way too far off that optimal path, then your EROEI levels really are going to, they're going to shut you down, because you're never going to be able to achieve your both economic competitiveness, but it also works its way through systemically, right? So Hegel, right, the German philosopher, he had a theory, of course, or a metaphysics of history, where reason unfolded, and he often called it the cunning of reason, where individual human beings would go about their daily existence, making the decisions that they make and doing the different things that they do, never once being conscious that in many ways they were the bearers of this broader historical force, the spirit of reason. In a sense, my own systemic approach to these questions is that we have in operations the cunning of thermoeconomics, or the cunning of entropy. These aren't things that we have to be conscious of, but they are things that ultimately create things that we respond to. So we don't run around measuring EROEI at a system level, but we do in the end notice that the infrastructure is crumbling.
I will ask you eventually about how we can begin to measure EROEI at a systematic level, but first I want to talk about the part of the book that I felt most torn about. So the part when you talk about how China is becoming a negentropic economy, whereas the US is becoming one that's representing entropic decay. On one hand, I felt your argument very persuasive. The parts about the infrastructure renewal, about how the continued investment in the past 3 decades in China has transformed the economy, that all made sense to me. But I was also thinking at the back of my head, like the local government debt issues, the ghost houses, the real estate bubble, like all of those real problems that the Chinese government, the Chinese economists are facing right now. How do they function into your framework of analysis? And I'm also thinking about the US. The US still has the deepest capital market, and so far still the most powerful military on earth. So like, how do those things feature in your analysis?
My take on it is that, of course, the building of physical stock is the manifestation of energy, right? That it is not being used today means that it is an energetic waste, no doubt about it. That's an entropic possibility. The question is whether or not that infrastructure can, in the next 2 or 3 years or whatever, ultimately become part of the useful fabric of energetic transformations within society. People move into them and start using them, living in them, and all of that. Of course, in a worst case scenario, you'll end up with incomplete things that will ultimately, in parts of the world, nature reclaims them, as we've seen, right?
They're just post-apocalyptic movies.
They're just left in neglect.
Yeah.
People, companies and people just walk away from these things, and people sort of forget about them. That can always happen in any society, by the way. When Xi Jinping made that famous observation that housing is for living in, not for speculating.
I agree with you with your analysis on the housing bubble, but I think this is a pretty classical economic analysis of the Chinese political economy. Where do you think your framework of thermoeconomics add to this analysis?
Well, it's just an example of how the system is constantly struggling. It's the dialectic between entropy and negentropy. And this is actually a pretty important distinction, or a way of understanding this, because the hollowing out of American industry over the course of the last 40 to 50 years is the direct corollary of the expansion of finance. And we hear often in China the political leadership talking about this idea of finance being there to serve the real economy.
So these are higher EROEI investments.
Much higher EROEI investments. And that's how we need to understand them, and that's why this system works. The fact that you have to manage the deleveraging at a money capital level is purely to contain the balance sheet fallout would otherwise happen. So that's one way of understanding the housing stuff. The local government debt stuff, and I think that just sort of continues to reflect the fact that Chinese governance at a public level through national governments, provincial governments, city governments or municipal governments is a very large and complex beast. And the central government isn't really a government that, goes and runs hospitals and builds hospitals and schools.
Yeah.
Those things are done actually at the edges. So this issue of debt is really one that is being managed not really as a balance sheet problem because they're not going to become insolvent.
So the general theme of the analysis is that we should look at what kind of investments they're making.
Yeah.
And in the past, there are some entropic investments in terms of housing, especially the ones that are in surplus.
Well, they can become entropics, but I guess what I try to inject into that is a tighter frame around when that liquidity injection is more useful than when it's not. Because if you just spray liquidity into the system, either by dropping checks or what have you, then you may not necessarily improve your system-wide EROEI. You may actually be undermining it. So you need to be framing those system liquidity injections with a mind to how do they ultimately contribute to your neg-entropic efforts.
And I imagine you would agree that part of the way we can read Xi Jinping's statement that we should direct money into the real economy as opposed to fictitious capital is a way to direct liquidity into areas of high EROEI, into entropic renewal.
That's right. And, and this issue of the real economy, I think, is also one that can be understood better through the frameworks that I've been articulating, because often when people throw the idea of real economy around, they have a narrow view that it relates solely to, the production of things. The real economy is manufacturing. Whereas my argument is that the real economy are activities that involve the mobilisation of energy and the transformation of material things and energy, which means that the services economy is also a really important part of the real economy, because the services economy, first and foremost, involves people, and people are embodied energy. Right? We are energetic ourselves. So it doesn't make the distinction between whether or not you leave a legacy of a tangible item or not, as the way that you distinguish the real economy from something else. The real economy is simply one where energetic transformations are taking place. The purpose, therefore, is to look at how those energetic transformations are being achieved in a way that contributes to social neg-entropy and warding off the inherent entropic trajectory of nature. And if we could think about it in that kind of way, then I think we will actually end up directing the liquidity into things that actually are energetically useful.
Right.
But they're not always going to be. It could be things like, the extent to which we provide infrastructure that supports gaming.
Yeah.
And at one level, intuitively, you might say, too much gaming may be really more entropic than neg-entropic.
Right. But that infrastructure also facilitates people running like open cloud, those AI systems that are productive. And
in other ways, right? So you do again always need to take this sort of system-wide approach. Right. It's easy to pick on single things, but sometimes they're offset by other things, or they enable other things to happen, or of course. And we must never forget this, that human societies are fundamentally about humans, right? Yeah, and human beings are not simple, optimized, energetic machines. We're complex sentient beings who who thrive in cultures that enable us to have pastimes and all of that. Yeah. And by having pastimes and having leisure,
makes us who we are.
Makes us who we are, yeah. And it also makes societies actually, more stable, more enjoyable, and all of that as well, which in and of itself has some negentropic properties.
When Professor Powell was talking about conscientious beings, my former colleagues in finance law, he's not really talking about you. Okay, so one last question, Professor. So if I'm totally sold on your theory, and I'm talking to a friend, say, doing policy advice to Chinese central bank, and he's saying, I need something measurable to see if the economy is moving towards the right direction. What kind of metrics, indexes should they be looking at?
Well, I think we need to actually, in a sense, fine-tune and make more scientific the Qingyang index, if I was to describe it in very Chinese terms, which is that
explain to our audience.
So for a long time, many, particularly Western critics of China, would criticize official statistics. And in fact, Chinese political leadership is often just as skeptical. They're actually very grounded people, and they have their eyes and ears wide open. And so Li Keqiang said, look, whatever the GDP numbers are, the numbers that are much harder to fudge is how much energy is being created, how much energy is being used, how many tons of this is being transformed into how many kilograms of that, how many litres of such and such are being used. And I think we actually need to be more focused on those very fundamental material metrics, things like kilowatts, joules, tons, kilograms, litres. And if we did that, I think we would actually end up with a much more sensible approach to how nature's resources are actually being managed, certainly in a way that gives us a clearer picture of the energetic return on energy invested. Increasingly with digitalisation, I think we are finally at a position where we can begin to grasp these elements of nature in ways that we struggled to before.
There you have it, guys. Thank you, Professor Powell. Just when I thought the theory is getting refreshingly simple, you're making it more complicated. So that was our conversation with Professor Powell. He offered a dense theory, and he'll be the first to acknowledge that his words are not the final one on either energy or economic development or national growth. But he is asking a question that most mainstream economists are not. And that is, how do we reconcile the conflict between imperial ambitions, military adventurism, and the ultimately finite resources on our planet? That question isn't going away, and neither are the conflicts in Middle East, the energy shocks that are the results of those conflicts. My name is Yun Peng, and thank you for watching Thinkers Forum.
Very critical and interesting perspectives on the questioning about energy and global power. And that's a wrap for today's edition of China Now. Big ideas, real world impacts, and plenty more to keep an eye on in the subsequent months. I am Akiza Latifa, and this has been China Now. Remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback, and suggestions for the coming episodes of the show through the email provided below. Catch you same time next week. Have a good day, and let China not be far away from you anymore.